Great. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mark Hodge, and I'm a senior associate at Shift. And I will say a few words in a moment about who I am and our organization. But just to say thank you to the organizers, to UNDP and others. We are delighted to be here today to be launching a number of practical tools for companies, investors, and standard setters to think about how do we measure impact and progress with regards to business respect for human rights, a key question for the decade ahead. We'll be using some slides, so I'm just going to bring those up now. Just to say, we are being joined by some speakers who I'll introduce briefly in a moment. A few of them are still joining due to technical issues, but they're speaking a bit later in the session, so we're okay. But great to have you with us. It's been a wonderful week here at the conference, and so we'll get started now. So just by way of goals, what we hope to do in this next hour and a half with you is to introduce you to new publicly available resources for measuring impact and progress of business respect for human rights. We have the pleasure of hearing from business leaders about opportunities to use the resources, these newly available resources. And then we've got a number of experts, some of whom you'll be very familiar with, that will help us reflect on how to advance the use of these resources and how that might advance the sort of next decade of action ahead. This is our list of speakers, which you would have seen on the agenda. Just want to extend Shift's gratitude to all of them for joining us today, for being participants not only in today's session, but having been involved in the last 3 years of the project that has been focused on developing the tools that we'll share today. I will also say that I'm joined by Jana Mudranova, who is an associate at Shift, and Jana has been working on the project with me, and she'll introduce herself in a short while. By way of quick introduction, for those that don't know us, Shift is a not-for-profit where we work on the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Our chair is Professor John Ruggie, the author of the Guiding Principles, and our founders were part of the team that worked on Professor Ruggie's mandate to develop the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So Shift has a deep heritage and a deep interest in advancing implementation and change and impact from all of our work. You can see here what Shift does. I won't go into the detail of it all, but we work with businesses, standard setters, and financial institutions. And the project that we are talking about today is one of Shift's flagship projects to try and address sort of one of the systemic challenges of implementing and advancing respect for human rights. This is our agenda. We have a lot to share with you today. The format will be quite a bit of from myself and my colleague Jana, as well as inputs from individual speakers at different points. Please use the Q&A function, and we will look to that to answer questions. And if we don't address your questions, we as Shift will find a way to sort of communicate back participants generally about the tools and resources. So just a quick bit of context from me about the journey that we have been on, this journey to better measurement. In 2018, the UN Working Group, reflecting on these systemic problems in implementing respect for human rights, commented on the lack of common understanding about which metrics and indicators to use to track and evaluate performance, both within companies themselves trying to drive change and other stakeholders, including investors. From Shift's perspective, we see this as a fundamental challenge to advancing the next decade in a meaningful way. If we don't know which efforts are making a difference to rights holders, if we don't know which initiatives really drive change, if we don't know which external pressures and incentives lead to meaningful business conduct, it is very, very hard to know where to invest resource, where to scale efforts, and also whether or not fundamentally, for all the progress we have seen, whether we are driving meaningful change in the structure of how business works and the impact on individuals who are at risk. We at Shift, at the beginning of the Value in Respect project, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment, tried to gather at the beginning of the project, also in 2018, some data about the problem in terms of which indicators and metrics were being used. And we looked at a number of sources, so company reports by industry and geography, and also a number of ESG ratings, rankings, indices, and benchmarks. Overwhelmingly, we found that the data that was being both used, requested of companies, and reported by companies, which we took as a proxy for the data and metrics that companies were using internally, was overwhelmingly looking at inputs, activities, and outputs. In other words, looking at allocation of human resource time, budgets, the level of activities, looking at numbers of assessments, numbers of trainings, numbers of audits, numbers of meetings with external stakeholders, those highly countable dynamics, and some midterm findings, right, results from assessments or numbers of non-compliance. So a huge weighting towards meaningful and important things to measure, such as effort, but at the same time, what we saw far less of was data about outcomes, data about what's really changing inside organizations, and lack of indicators and ways to measure that impact. Where there was outcome data, it was largely in regulated space, such as health and safety, and diversity and inclusion, which are obviously certain aspects of human rights which are more mature. So that was the problem. And in fact, the Value and Respect project, this was the first thing we did, is try and provide some evidence or data about the nature of the problem. And I should say that the data I just shared was consistent across every region and every industry. It really was very, very common. It wasn't that one industry or geography is doing far better. It was very consistent. So the project which we are talking about today has been a multi-year effort for the last 3.5 years, generously funded by Norges Bank Investment Management, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. To take time during this project to figure out how can we advance thinking. Clearly the problem wasn't that there was some indicator set sitting on a shelf somewhere that none of us had found. Our perspective was that we needed a collaborative process to really understand how to co-create better ways of thinking about measurement and better ways of developing practical tools for those inside of companies and those outside of companies. So this is the journey we've been on. In the project page, you can find an outline of our consultations, many of which were in Southeast Asia and across the wider region, and also in other regions as well as engagements with individual experts across many different disciplines. It's important for me to say that all of the resources we share today are publicly available. They are free to use, and we encourage people to use them and adapt them. These aren't Shift or proprietary in any shape or form, and they're already publicly available on the Value and Respect website. So what are the tools? Let me just say a few words about what they are and the structure of the 4 resources we'll share today, and then we'll move into talking about the substance of each of them. There are really 2 categories of tools that we'll be talking about today. One for evaluating impact or progress and impact. And here, throughout the project and early on, we had a number of different questions from different stakeholders. So for people inside companies, are efforts, are programs really making a difference, right? For those practitioners that are trying to address risks to human rights as part of their due diligence. For executives, how do they know where to allocate resources? Which things are making a difference? Which things are driving change and effectively managing those risks to people? Which might be doing a less good job, and where to bet on those initiatives that are working? And then from many other stakeholders, the fundamental question of, well, what is the role of affected people in measuring impact? And therefore we generated two tools which we'll share today, with help from many on the line and many of you, I'm sure, an indicator design tool, which we'll talk to, and then a series of case studies and methodologies to measure quality of relationship between companies and affected stakeholders. On the other end, we also had questions that were more about how companies were wired. So is the company really set up from the level of strategy and culture to respect people? For those outside of companies, is advocacy really helping, right, to create sort of authentically responsible corporations? Do we know that those policies and processes are really changing the way that companies behave and the way they think and interact in the world? And from an investor perspective, how do investors make judgments, meaningful judgments around whether the company's DNA and what is really trending towards respect for people or not? And we'll talk about two resources again here, a business model red flags resources, and then some leadership and governance indicators. So Jana, I'm going to hand over to you now to take us through that first section of tools for evaluating impact. And Jana, please introduce yourself and add in anything I've missed about context, but over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So before I jump into the two tools, I would like to briefly say about my role in the project. I spent the last 3 years supporting Mark and leading work on the quality of relationship stream, which we will talk about today. My own background is in monitoring and evaluation of impact projects, in stakeholder engagement with communities and workers in mining. The first tool we will talk about today is the indicator design tool, which was launched last week. And as Mark said, you can access it freely on our website, and I really encourage you to do so. So what is this tool? It is very common for us to see companies to have programs in place to address different human rights issues in their operations and supply chains. And that can be a women empowerment program, can be decent work programs, it can be programs to eliminate forced labor. And this tool was really designed to help companies and their stakeholders to develop and work with the indicators for these or similar programs. Mark really talked about the journey that we went through and this number of stakeholders that we consulted. And what we really heard was the need to shift companies' attention from measuring activities to really start thinking more strategically about what objectives their programs want to achieve in terms of human rights. And this new way of thinking really requires new tools. We also heard companies practitioners looking for a simple management tool which would help them develop indicators to measure progress. And that's why we brought the learnings from the monitoring and evaluation in the international development field, in the non-profit sector, and in the public policy field. And we really designed this tool to be versatile for the company practitioners to use it to measure outcomes of their global strategies or their specific programs in a specific locations. It can also be used when they are launching a new program or when they are evaluating an existing programs. It can also be used to evaluate individual programs, which is led by a company in one specific location, or it can also be used to evaluate multi-stakeholder initiatives and programs which have different components. So when working with the tool, you will work through 7 steps. First, articulating strategy, really focusing on the outcomes for people in terms of human rights, and behaviors of those that you want to change. Then you use the tool to design the activities, outputs, inputs, and outcomes for business. In step 4 and 5, you will map contextual factors or risk or dependencies, which might be an obstacle to achieving the outcome. And in the last 2 steps, steps 6 and 7, you use the tool to develop the targets and indicators to measure the progress towards your objective, as well as impact. I want to shortly present a very high-level example of a company that might have identified that they want to achieve a greater pay and more equity and reduce the workplace harassment in factories. They already might have in place certain activities, which would be a training for the management of the factory. And they might well have certain indicators in place in which they are measuring the number of factory managers trained, or even number of women at the management roles. However, there's this big gap between having an activity in place and really changing female workers' lives, what is also sometimes called missing middle. So what this indicator design tool helps you to do is really think strategically through different steps, moving from inputs, activities, outputs, practices, and behaviors, outcomes for people, as well as outcomes for business, and think of what needs to be in place to really achieve greater equality at the workplace. It also helps you then design the indicators so you can measure that you're really achieving the change in a systematic way. And speaking about the contextual factors, it will also help you think through of what kind of barriers they are that might prevent you from achieving the outcome. So this can be that actually female workers lack technical skills to be promoted to managerial positions. And by voicing one of those risks, you will start thinking about how you can address it, and also what kind of indicators you can put in place to measure them. I mean, this is just an example of some of the indicators that might be designed using this indicator design tool in this specific example. The red indicators are the indicators who speak to the context or the risks. So as we said, the resource comprises of the guidance and templates, which you can find on our website. We encourage you to download them, work with them. As an example of what you can find in one of these guidance, it is a step-by-step guide that helps you work through the steps. It also includes different tips. In this one, which is about the targets and indicators, you will be able to think about how to collect data, how often to collect them, how to engage affected stakeholders in evaluation, how to connect your targets to the SDG goals, for example. And as Mark mentioned, they're freely available, so we encourage you to go and look at them. We also have with us Begas Tutaselvi from Inditex, one of the companies that really help us test, improve, and give us feedback on this tool. So I now want to invite Begum to talk about her experience with the tool.
for several years, and for over a year now, I'm overseeing the projects in the countries and leading a global team. So in social sustainability, we have a strategy that puts workers at the center and encompasses 7 priority impact areas ranging from women empowerment to protection of refugees. And these were identified based on the human rights due diligence study that we conducted with the guidance of SHIFT. So these areas, all of them have their global objectives, and in line with those objectives, despite our other efforts, we implement projects that aim to create a positive impact on people. And for this we don't do it alone, we engage with organizations, local and global, including NGOs, universities, unions, or other institutions. So over the years, we have gained experience and learning in different countries. And I can say that our paths crossed with the indicator design tool and webinars of SHIFT at a perfect moment, because maybe most of you would agree with me that this area is a challenging area to find a tool that is holistic, that a reference actually to help us in effective measurement of impact. So at that time, we were in the process of creating a global structure on projects. A team was formed, and we were exploring the effective methods or tools that can help us align the projects and scale, help us actually guiding our decision making in scaling these projects globally. So in the trainings we attended as a team, and to learn about this methodology, and as Jana said, it is really a step-by-step guidance that takes you through from start to the end, and it is really clear. We had the chance to practice it with examples also. For us, it was quite exciting to see how the theory of change logic works, and then how it actually turns into a practical ground to develop and measure indicators. Within the theory of change, there were some new concepts for us, like practices and behaviors, or changes in practices in behaviors, but we actually saw that fits well into the context, and it even brings clarity to the whole results chain. We have also seen that the tool works well with the complex programs, like those that have more than one pillar or more than one focus area, because we are actually, when addressing actually a human rights risk, that may require more than one focus area or different pillars. And instead of bringing more complexity, I would say, it helped us to clearly map out and establish connections. The support of SHIFT has been amazing during and after the trainings, and that can be actually one of the reasons why we felt confident and encouraged to use this methodology. We are integrating it in our global guidance manual on project management, and we believe that it is beneficial for us to apply in a structured way to understand the effectiveness of our projects and the impact that we are creating through those. So, of course, this was from our side, but I also want to share that in general, what we saw is that it is a practical methodology that helps you build a robust theory of change on how you want to achieve the expected outcomes on people by logically thinking and involving stakeholders. The great thing is that it keeps you focused on those. So you focus on that direction, you stay on that direction, rather than maybe getting lost in measuring a pile of indicators, in the delivery of activities or outputs. You focus on what is important. There is a good and clear guidance on how actually to do that, to develop meaningful indicators for that. And this can give companies an opportunity to understand how and to what extent the changes occurring on the ground, and what is the impact on people's lives. What is working, like which project is working, or is it really working or not, and why? So I think these are important questions, or like it helps to answer those questions in a way. And one of the aspects I believe that what makes it unique is that it has a specific focus on human rights. And it can help companies to build deeper understanding in terms of local challenges or local needs, the reality and the real needs on the ground, and with respect to certain issues. And also, it allows a high-level vision. By looking at the progress and effectiveness of the efforts and or the projects or any other activities, companies can actually take actions. And it can be about scaling up, like in our case, or it can be stopping an intervention and let's say, canalizing towards another direction because it's not creating any impact. So these are all important guiding points, I believe, for companies. And by this way, they can accelerate their efforts on human rights. So well, this is a journey, and regardless of where the companies are at this journey, Shift is a key partner that has a solid foundation and leading expertise on human rights. And what I can say is that it is a powerful tool that could be explored as it could respond to different needs at many levels. So this is all from my side, and thank you all so much.
Thank you, Begum. It's very encouraging to hear that this tool and the thinking continues to live on outside our engagement. And this is exactly what we are trying to achieve, to have companies, practitioners to take these tools, adapt them to their company needs, and then kind of carry them without us. Another tool that I wanted to talk to you about today is the quality of relationship. It's a resource that was launched also last week, and you can find these resources on our website. It really is a collection of case studies and methodologies about how companies can evaluate the quality of their relationship with affected stakeholders. We created this resource because we often see companies talking about stakeholder engagement, but only from their own perspectives. And we wanted to really focus on how affected stakeholders view that relationship and how it can be assessed from their perspectives. So once again, moving away from the indicators in which companies counting number of meetings with their communities to really seek the views about the quality of that relationship from the community members, from the workers, and so on. Because we see the quality of relationship as a real-time indicator whether the company has a culture of respect in place. And it also helps the company understand if it's achieving the outcomes that they want to, and also if those outcomes are being taken on by the affected stakeholders. These resources are for companies, for the managers at the sites who want to assess the quality of relationship with their communities, for example, or that they want to measure the quality of relationship between supervisors and factory workers, or between the factory workers themselves. It can also be used by companies to measure the relationship at the supplier sites and so on. The collection consists of 8 resources. There are 3 case studies that are covering real-life examples of companies using interesting methods to measure relationship in their sites or supply chains. This ranges from factories in China to tobacco farms in Indonesia and mining communities in South Africa. The remaining resources are innovative methods of measuring relationship using worker surveys on mobile phones, or collecting short stories using interviews, or using regular micro-surveys to get people perceptions. And today we will focus on one of these resources in particular, and we have with us Shirley Nee from Best Buy, which use behavioral change experiments to improve relationship between supervisors and workers in their factories in China. And I would like to give floor to Shirley.
Thank you, Yana and Mark, and hello everyone. So before I get started, a little bit introduction about Best Buy and myself in case you don't know Best Buy. So Best Buy is the largest consumer electronic retailer in the United States. I'm the Associate Director of the Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability for Best Buy. So in my role, I lead a team based in China and responsible for the strategic direction and execution of Best Buy Supply Chain Sustainability Program and the Best Buy Asia Community Relations Program as well. Next slide, please. So I can't control. Yes, thank you. Firstly, I should say thanks, Shift, for inviting me to this forum. And also, I would like to take the opportunity to thank you, Shift, for your interest, support, and guidance regarding the case study, and also for our program. And even broader work in supply chain is really great, helpful, and appreciated. So back to the case study. The case study was based on two factories pilot training program we call the Worker Empowerment Program. So the training was conducted in our two suppliers in China between 2018 and 19. The purpose of the case study is assessing whether behavior change training can improve the relationship between a supervisor and the workers. So in this slide, I think I can answer two questions maybe you have in your mind, and why the training and how we measure the training, and that's especially why we apply RTC. So why the training? For years, and the same as the many other companies, Best Buy drive supplier code compliance through auditing and code focus training. So while we're asking ourselves, actually, the question is what is working, what's not working, and why. So actually, this is really a journey of exploring and learning about how to work and how to make the training more efficient. But more is trying to understand what's the factory workers' needs and their voice. So for us, align Best Buy strategy to UN guiding principle means that we want to engage workers directly. So this requires a shift in my team's mindset about the purpose of work and also the importance of workers' voice in evaluating outcomes. So in 2016, Best Buy, we developed our audit program with worker survey so that we could hear directly from workers about their working condition, as well as their concerns, hopes, their expectations about their jobs. So with the survey, we learned that one factor that contribute to the turnover rate is about the poor relationship with line worker and line supervisor. So further, we believe that the poor relationship indicate both lack of the soft skill and also the potential for code violation, including like the human treatment or the workers' feedback or grievance at the lecture. So thereby, we develop worker empowerment program to develop a soft skill of the line supervisor by working with the third-party organization Verity. So that's about the training. Next question will be, okay, how we measure the training and why we put it in RCT using this methodology and how that work. So actually in this training program, we place the emphasis on measurement as we particularly interesting about understanding the impact of the training across the variety of dimensions, including the implication of it had on the turnover rate. So we utilize an academic approach to more fully understand the impact of the training. And so I will show you how that works in next slide. So So next slide, and you can see very lovely diagram created by Shift. So I really love it because the diagram really nicely lay out the project design and the timeline. Allow for the more accurate and objective measurement of the training result. Supervisor was split. Supervisor is the target of the training. So we split the supervisor into two groups. One is we call experimental group. Another, this group will participate in the training section, and then the other is control group. And the control group, they did not attend any of the training section. So the training consists of 4 sections, all focused on their leadership, awareness, skill, and capability. So the experimental group needs to take the knowledge test before and after the training to measure their knowledge change. So this is one dimension. And all the supervisors need to do the baseline survey and the post survey to measure their behavior change and the impact on the daily work through the worker satisfaction survey. So that's about survey part. The supervisor was assigned to the two groups. The two groups have nearly identical demographic characters and had a very similar average evaluation score from pre-training worker survey and after the based on the pre-training worker survey, so that the in experimental and the control group will they can close mirror each other. So that's the methodology. So we put a lot of design to set up 2 groups so that we can make a comparison. So next slide, I can share more about the survey part. Yes, you can see this is the slide is we can take a look at the survey. So Verity designed the survey and including 22 multiple questions and 2 open-ended questions to assess workers on their communication skill and conflict solution skill and overall leadership skill. And these are some examples of the question and comparison rating before and after training for the experimental group. So we can see the improvements, right, through the comparison. The biggest change, you can see the line bar, is the question 18. 18 is about stress management, had a lot of increase from 44% to 77%. So that's really big improvement for the faculty and both of the workers. Beyond the academic approach to measure the result, we also did some worker interview and focus group interview. We received a lot of really overwhelmingly positive feedback from the training participants and also their line workers, how they express their gratitude and also the very heartwarming stories. And I think those other feedbacks are the indicators and demonstrate the success of the working empowerment program. Yes. So to wrap up my section, and quickly, I have 3 things to want to share, and what we learned, and also what have been improved due to the selection, the evaluation. The first, for sure, is we have the robust evidence about the success and challenge of the training program that allow us to communicate our outcome of our efforts and to the stakeholders in balanced way, and also identify improvements that we can put in place before scaling of the program into the other location. So we did a program in more 3 factories of the pilot, and it was delayed because of the COVID-19 last year, but we hope we can continue this year as the COVID-19 situation gets much improved in China. The second learning is about we should working with the sub partner like Shift, right? And that's a really great opportunity to reframe the problem and how we can find different solutions. And great benefits from working with Shift for their powerful and wonderful questions, and let us review our program from different angles. And also we're working with the academic professor for RTC methodology, and also working with the third-party organization Verity to deliver high quality and unique training. And the last is not the least, and that is an example of the thoughtful, innovative, and strategic and human-centered approach that my team applied to all the work that we do with our suppliers. I'm very proud of the team and of shifting our mindset and the way we're working with supplier and engaging with the factories. So I think that the world won't change, right, unless we change. So the real connection starts when we become humble and vulnerable. So I'm really grateful to work with the leaders and my teams at Best Buy. And also they really hold great value and bring very beautiful mind or heart to the work. So that's the root of any quality relationship. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Shirley, for sharing your experience. And I really like this case study because it helps us move the field forward. And just to quickly wrap up, you can, as I said, you can find all the resources on our website. You can download them and share them with your colleagues. Think how you can apply them in your own context and your own sector. There's also a document that highlights key learnings from these past 3 years. And you can really expand them and see how diverse these methodologies and examples are, and what the roles of the voice of affected stakeholders in evaluation is. And I would like to hand over to Mark, who wants to take some of the questions that were submitted.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jana, Begum, and Shirley. Thank you all for the excellent questions from the floor, which I hope you can all see there in the system. Let me just comment on some of those questions, being mindful of time, and we'll make sure we share, obviously, our contact details afterwards, so those that want to follow up can do so. So there's one question here just about how many companies have used the tool so far. Should emphasize that the final version of the tool was only released about 10 days or last week, 8 days ago. But we've had, during the process of creating the tool, probably about 15 or so companies that have tried to pilot the application of different versions of the tool as we've been working on those. That includes companies in Thailand, companies in Poland, companies in South Africa, elsewhere, and a whole range of different industries. I'll also say that we have been working with a large collaborative industry initiative that focuses on forced labor to pilot the tool in relation to collective action that their members take to drive change in their supply chains in relation to forced labor. Another theme in the questions that's come up, which is excellent, really great questions, is to talk a question about the relationship of the indicator design tool and these resources with benchmarks and disclosure frameworks. And I want to emphasize here that this tool is not a new disclosure framework, nor is it a new reporting framework. What the indicator design tool is a management tool for practitioners inside of companies to design indicators that work for their specific context and their specific programs. It is not a new set of indicators that Shift is then going to somehow rate or rank companies against. It is not the purpose of the tool. It is very much a management tool for practitioners to help them advance business respect for human rights, to help them advance their programs. Now, a number of those benchmarks and a number of the reporting framework discussions that Shift is obviously closely related to, I think, have all recognized the challenge of getting to what some might call performance, in other words, outcome, behavior change on the ground. And so we hope over time that certainly as these tools advance and as over the next decade, we get better use of indicators and more meaningful indicators about outcome, that they will become more common and therefore more meaningful and more realistic for benchmarks, rankings and ratings and disclosure frameworks to include requests about outcome indicators. But this is not a new ranking, it's not a new requirement or reporting framework, it's a management tool for individuals inside of companies. And I think that's important to emphasize, that not every indicator, not every effort to measure should be about a disclosure necessarily. Many of them might be, and companies may choose to disclose, or many may be subject to disclosure. But also, what we want to emphasize, consistent with the UN guiding principles, is that tracking meaningful design of indicators to evaluate the effectiveness of programs must be done in a more robust way, and that's what we hope this tool supports with. Related to that, and this is the last question I'll take, and then we'll have to move on, the question about performance incentives around C-suites. Again, we are not advocating for a company to follow indicators A, B, and C, or to offer ways in which they can embed performance frameworks into their company. What we do think is that the more that companies articulate clearer targets for their salient human rights issues, and the more they have meaningful indicators that can tell you more, that talk beyond policies and processes and numbers of training, etc., that there's opportunity for companies to connect back to performance incentives for the organization and leaders within the organization. But we have to link performance incentives to meaningful indicators. And so I can't emphasize enough that this is about supporting the innovation around indicator and measurement development, as against Shift advocating for his 4 or 5 indicators for this program or this type of program that should be used. So just want to bring that point together. Now, companies, there may be convergence around those external companies develop using this tool, to be seen, I think, in practice as we move forward. I'm going to then, I think that covers off the large amount of the spirit of lots of those questions. Let me now, with everyone's permission, just move us forward into the second category of outputs that we'll be sharing. And again, I'll just remind you about what they are. And then we have now one speaker who will speak to certainly one of those resources in a similar way to the way that Begum and also Shirley did. And we have Yuri Herder from ABN AMRO, who's going to do that in a few seconds. So as you can see on the slides, which will come up in a few moments, what we're talking about now is that second set of questions that speak to the organizational context in which efforts to due diligence occur, in which programs are implemented. It speaks to what we are describing as how companies are wired. We often hear the commentary about that the company's DNA matters, that tone at the top matters. We heard those questions back from investors, from senior leaders and others. And the challenge was, how could we develop indicators that help us measure or indeed understand the level of risk associated with a particular business based on whether it's addressing some of those indicators and some of those issues. So the first tool within this category of how companies are wired is a set of business model red flags. They're indicators which are available online for everyone to use, to download and browse through. So what are they? The red flag indicators are features of business models that carry inherent human rights risk. In other words, they speak to whether the business strategy is fundamentally wired or set up to, maybe not intentionally, but generate adverse human rights impacts. And the example that we often use here is fast fashion, where all of the audit or supply chain efforts, responsible supply chain efforts of a company could be very, very useful in driving supplier awareness about working standards. But if buying behavior, if purchasing practices consistently drive down cost or change orders due to the business model of that company, we have a slightly larger, more fundamental challenge about how to really achieve respect for workers in the supply chain. That's one example in one industry context. And our question was, surely we could identify other similar red flags in other industries as well, and maybe even identify, which is what we've done, an industry neutral set of red flags. Why have we done them? I mean, as I just described, these red flags, we believe they need to be emphasized because they will be connected to a company's salient human rights risk, right? If it's baked into a business model, it will fundamentally consistently drive a repetition of adverse outcomes or increased risk for workers, for communities, etc. And we wanted to target these resources at business leaders. In other words, whether business leaders are approached by investors or by internal practitioners, we believe that these types of issues can really only be dealt with at that level of the C-suite, of senior leaders or founders and entrepreneurs of companies. Right? It's very much a business design question as against an operational due diligence question. And you can see there some of the users. They offer business leaders, investors, and also other standard setters, civil society organizations as well. Just go back one slide. This is the menu of business model red flags that we have generated through research partnerships, through extensive consultation in different parts of the world and with different industries and different stakeholder groups, to try and pinpoint what might be those red flags. And you can see they're structured into 3 categories. One speaks to red flags that might be found in the value proposition of a company. In other words, it's the way what it offers to the marketplace, what it offers to its customers. Is there something in that that fundamentally is carrying a human rights risk? The second category is the value chain. So we look at business relationships across the value chain. So not just supply chain, but also customers, consumers. And then the last one is the cost and structure and revenue model. So are the ways that the company seeks to drive down cost or maximize revenue, are they connected to potentially adverse human rights impacts? So you can see these are strategic questions, and what we've identified here is individual red flags. We are not suggesting that these are the only red flags, but they are the ones that continue to come to the surface through consultation and through research that we did over the course of the project. Each red flag is supported by an underlying resource of 4 to 5 pages, because what we recognized is that it was useful perhaps to identify red flags and enable investors and companies to make that identification, and civil society and standard setters also. But identifying a red flag only gets you so far. What we want to do is drive action around that red flag. So the resource that you can find online, each of them goes through these 4 different layers. It provides an overview of the individual red flag. It unpacks the risk analysis. So it looks at both risk to people with real world examples of where risk has occurred to workers or communities or consumers. And then also risk to business. So real world data, information, cases, fines, operational challenges that companies have faced because they haven't dealt with that business model risk and that business model issue. We then move on to do in level 3 some analysis around what is the responsibility of a company to act in relation to this business model feature. So does it cause contribution or is it linked to the risk? And include their SDG analysis also, to make the point that if a company is able to mitigate the risk or change their business model, they could have a huge opportunity to contribute to SDGs. And level 4, a critical level, is there's a section which asks some due diligence questions and then provides example real-world mitigation actions that companies have taken. And in some instances, provide alternative business models, right? So to say, well, we cannot meaningfully mitigate this. We really have to go to changing the fundamental business model at heart. And there's some additional resources here as well. So that's the resource and a quick introduction. Please do go online to look at those. What I'd like to do now is invite, sorry, let me just say one more thing about the resource, and then I'll invite Yuri to speak to that. So what we've heard, and these are use cases, I should say, they are some of which are beginning to be applied in practice. Some of them are use cases that we've heard different groups identify as possible with using these red flags. And I'm certainly not going to describe all of them, but you can see there the different user groups. So there's some board level applications where boards might be able to select and then make deeper inquiry of executives about whether business models are generating human rights risk. There's some activities that business leaders can implement informed by the red flags. There's a piece on lenders and investors, both in terms of screening and engagement with clients. And then there's a regulator, analyst, and civil society piece, which really speaks to, are we getting at the fundamental core of what might be driving human rights risk, about what is creating these social externalities, right, into the world, or externalities on people. So I am now, sorry, Yuri, to have delayed for a few seconds there, but would love to hand over to you to give your perspective from ABN AMRO about the resources and just what you found through beginning to use them, even though they're quite new.
Thank you very much, Mark, and for having me. I'm Yuri Herder. My title has changed, I see now, so I'm a business and human rights advisor. Shifted a little bit towards the UGPs at ABN AMRO, a large Dutch bank. And a couple of months ago now, we got to know the business model Redflex from SHIP. And at ABN AMRO, we're currently assessing the potential of the Redflex in our client due diligence processes. The Redflex could particularly be helpful for us to enable us to instantly put a finger on where the cause of human rights issues at a company that we finance lies. For instance, an example in the Netherlands, there's a new app. It's called Gorillas. It's a app that promises to deliver groceries at your home in less than 10 minutes. I'm using it quite a lot myself. But using the Redflex tool, we can easily see that this company's business model might put labor rights of workers of Gorillas at risk because of, for example, safety issues on the road, because they have to deliver it very fast to someone's house. And until now, ABN AMRO has been assessing clients based on risks that we associate with a certain sector and what we expect from our clients. Sorry, can everybody hear me properly? Because I'm getting a message that someone can't. Mark?
Yeah. Yuri, do you happen to have headphones or that you could use? And if not, maybe just try and speak more closely to the microphone.
Yeah, I can. Is it better like this?
Yes, that's great. If you could just be as close as you can.
I'm going to sit a little bit down towards my laptop. Was my first part a little bit more clear? Yeah? Okay. Perfect.
So yeah, if you could just repeat just the headlines of what you've said already, because I think some of it was a bit unclear, and then we can keep going. Don't worry about time.
Yeah, I will. So I was telling at the beginning that at ABN AMRO we're currently assessing the potential of the Redflex in our client due diligence processes. The Redflex could particularly be helpful for us as they enable us to instantly put a finger on where the cause for human rights issues at the company that we finance lies. For instance, in the Netherlands, I was telling that an example that there's a new app that I'm myself are using quite a lot. It's called Gorillas, and it promises to deliver groceries at your home in less than 10 minutes. But using the Redflex tool, we can easily see that the company's business model might put the labor rights of the workers of Gorillas at risk, since they have to be at someone's home really, really fast, and that might cause some safety issues along the road. So that might be something that comes up during client assessment. Up until now, ABN AMRO has been assessing clients based on risk that we associate with their sector and what we expect from our clients in terms of managing these risks. So we are discussing those risks with the clients and ask them what they are doing to mitigate the risks. But the added value for us and the potential that we see from the business model Redflex is that it enables us to tackle the issues at the source, so at the cause. A Redflex, so that's a Redflex in the business model of a corporate client of us. We see this approach of looking at the source of an issue as potentially more comprehensive than looking at a rather reactive risk management approach of a client or risk management practices of our clients, which we assess. As a starting point for investigating this potential, we've now plotted the red flags in our sector-based risk approach. So for each of our high-risk sectors, so that could be apparel, commodities, energy, everything. The tool identifies various business models that could be applicable within those sectors. And the tool has formulated the red flags for those business models. At the time of, so that could be multiple business model per sector, but also multiple red flags per business model. At time of the assessment of a client, this enables the analyst of ABN AMRO to ask a client the right questions related to a particular red flag. So with regard to the gorillas example, a relevant question would be, how do you ensure that the workers are able to deliver the product safely, given the short time that they have for delivery? Second thing we are currently investigating is the usefulness of the red flags in response to upcoming regulations that require banks to have oversight or insight in our outside-in risks. So the risk to business. This is also a quite comprehensive part of the tool as well. The tool includes an overview of the possible risks to business that stem from certain human rights abuses associated with specific business models as well. For example, the tool includes reputational risks, so risks for business that are caused by public backlash that is caused by a human rights abuse that occurs at a company, or operational risks for a company that are caused by, for example, strikes of workers. These insight into risk business that stem from human rights abuses can be relevant in client conversations as well, since clients might be interested to know consequences of improper human rights risk management, which is for some companies still quite new field of that they are discovering. Finally, the last part or last thing in our company that we are investigating how we can use the red flags is a training for our business lines, so our client-facing staff. This way, our colleagues can get familiar with what to look for when assessing clients on human rights risks. They can get a hold on so what kind of red flags they have to look for in particular business models of their clients. So for certain specific sectors, there are, as I told, specific business models that could be applicable. And for our client-facing staff that are working in those sectors, we have set out the business models that are the business model red flags that are applicable to those sectors, and told them what kind of questions you can ask clients to see if they have in scope all the risks that come along with or are inherent to those business models. So this is somewhat more of raising awareness among our employees and the tool gives us really good yeah, I'm not sure about the English words, but to hold on to how to grapple with assessing clients on human rights risks. Yeah, thank you. That's how we do. We have started with the tool and at ABN AMRO, and we think it's really promising.
Thank you, Yuri. Hugely valuable, and appreciate, as we have with all the companies and others using these to use these tools in their very early life. So much appreciated. We have. I'm just going to respond to one question about the red flags. tool that's come up, and then I'm going to do about 5 to 7 minutes on the final resource before we hand over to Tanya and Dr. Sari and Harpreet, who have been very patient, sort of reflecting on what they're hearing, to help us sort of step back and think about, the opportunities to use these tools or their general reflections as experts on these. We have a question here about the need to target this question of business models to regulators because they're sort of structural challenges. And as I said, I think that's absolutely correct, that over time and near term, increasing our attention to whether companies are addressing the business model risk, or indeed thinking about the role of regulation in creating guardrails or structures that make certain business models less competitive, right, and less profitable. I think that is absolutely part of the journey we have to go down as well. We are realistic in that regard, and I think that that's part of our commitment now with these resources, and we already have been engaging those external organizations as well. I will also say that, and I don't say that this tool should claim credit for this, but we're pleased to see in the new proposed revision of the corporate human rights benchmark a now a reference to business models. And this is the draft methodology, so out for consultation, but very much them beginning to say, can we see evidence that the company has identified and thought through its business model risk? So I think slowly we can see change. And again, in the decade ahead, I hope that this dramatically becomes useful to help focus all of our attention on those business model realities. So last 5 minutes from me now, just in terms of the final resource. So if I could have the slides back up, that would be great. And this this final resource really speaks to, again, the question of how companies are wired, but at the level of governance and leadership, with a view to whether there is a culture of respect for human rights being embedded within organizations and within the company. They're publicly available, but effectively what these are is a series of indicators that pay great attention to whether the actions of boards and senior leaders are fostering a culture of respect for people. So what do senior leaders say, do? What do board members say and do? And is it enabling the company to meaningfully anticipate and address risks to people? Why have we focused on this, and why have we focused on culture? Well, culture is very much a reflection of what gets done day to day in reality. Policies, processes, training programs tell us what's supposed to happen in organizations. Culture tells us far more about what actually happens on a day-to-day basis. And who are these resources for? A similar set of user groups. Certainly executives within organizations, but also people outside of organizations looking to ask questions, to engage, to produce some analysis, to look for better disclosure around leadership and governance of a company with regards to how it addresses risks to people. The indicators are organized into 10 governance indicators and 12 leadership indicators. There's a lot of detail and it's very small. I apologize on the slide, but these are the 10 governance indicators. Please visit the site to review them and look at them. They cover questions like the degree to which the board itself is meaningfully discussing and aware of the company's salient human rights risks. Also, the degree to which the board itself has mechanisms to hear from experts and affected stakeholders from within outside the business. Also speaks to questions of performance incentives. Does the board even think about performance incentives and review performance incentives, both those that might be put in place to support actions on salient issues, but also performance incentives that might undermine or might rather create behaviors that undermine respect for human rights, right? Sales targets or production targets, for example. And the final one here is the board approving high-level targets for salient human rights risks, right? Are there goals that companies have these for increasingly for climate, increasingly for other areas of sustainability, but it's very common and normal practice across all areas of business to think about targets We're not that yet there in this when we think about impacts on people, but we believe that that's something that increasingly boards should be seen as responsible for in terms of their duties. The next 12 indicators are indicators of leadership behavior, not just top management, but also further down in the organization. So leaders at plant level, leaders of particular business units or functions. And what they describe, and you can't see them on the slide, what they basically describe is a set of behaviors, day-to-day behaviors that we would want to see leaders do in order to be fostering a culture of respect for human rights. That includes meaningful engagement with affected groups. It includes creating space for bad news to travel up the organization or challenges to travel up the organization. It includes praising behaviors that are geared towards respect for human rights, finding ways to call out behavior that is not consistent with the company's commitment, as well as being very proactive around pressures on not just employees, but also contractors and other business partners. So a number of indicators there. I will say two things here. There are, before I talk about the levels of what is the underlying resource. So each indicator has an underlying resource that guides how to use that indicator. What I should say before that is that we do not imagine that all 22 indicators will be used at all times by everybody. They are a menu, and they are a menu created so that experts, companies, investors, others can make judgments about which of these indicators are going to be most meaningful for me inside my organization, or indeed are most meaningful for me to ask about from outside of the organization. And we don't have time today, but soon we'll be posting some tutorials about how to think about the selection of indicators. What I want to talk about now is just the underlying resource. So similar to the red flags, there's some guidance about how to use the resources. There's an overview sheet, which is really targeted at why this indicator, what are some key questions that could be asked of senior leaders in regards to beginning to assess the indicator. Level 2 speaks to application. So it guides a little bit as to the opportunity to think about internal application of assessing indicators and external, so things that might be in ratings or rankings or in disclosure, or that investors might use in their engagement. And again, not all of them will be available, or not all of them necessarily will avail themselves of disclosure, for example. Some of them will more than others, and we provide some guidance on those. And the final level just speaks about managing the unintended consequence of using one indicator to show how complementary indicators could give you more confidence that what you're learning is true, that there is a reduction on the risk of, say, gaming particular indicators, though we think they're already quite hard to meet in and of themselves individually. But there's a whole piece there on combination to manage the reality that one indicator alone is always going to have problems and limits to it. So my last slide here is just to use cases again. And just to emphasize, these are all, by the way, publicly available, these use cases. We expand on each of those bullet points to say a little bit more. But again, similar to the red flags, for boards, for business leaders, also for lenders and investors, regulators and civil society and analysts as well, right? So really looking at things like, if an incident occurred, is it likely to recur because of something about the culture? Also looking at potentially specific human rights issues and taking the indicators, adapting them to speak to not just general human rights issues, but maybe a specific issue like forced labor, for example, or land-related human rights issues. So a lot of opportunity to really use these in different contexts, and to treat them as open source, right? To treat them as indicators that are available, that are free, that can be adapted. Certainly that should be adapted carefully, but certainly we encourage that sort of innovation and creativity with the resources. That is a lot of information to be sharing with all of you during this session. The tools are public, as we've said multiple times. They are now all available. We will be making enhancements to make them more user-friendly as we move forward. We didn't want to wait for the perfect design and formulation to release them, so please start using them. But to wrap up in our last 15 minutes, what we really want to do is invite now Tanya from the Global Compact Thailand, Dr. Suri, and also Harpreet, to just sort of give your perspectives, if you will, about what you've heard in terms of the resources, what you see as some of the opportunities or challenges to be applying these, and where you would, I suppose, call on all of us to look for opportunities for greater uptake and resources of these uptake of these resources, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. If any participants have questions, please continue to type them as our three speakers comment, and if we have time, we'll address them towards the end. So Tanya, over to you to quickly introduce yourself and to give your reflections about the resources, given you've been very close as a regional partner in helping construct them. You are on mute, Tanya, at the moment. Oh. So we can't hear you, Tanya. I'm going to ask our technical team if that is a problem our side or with Tanya.
How about now?
Perfect.
Is it coming?
Yes.
The voice is okay. Thank you.
Yes. Great. And 5 minutes each, please, I should have said.
Sure. From the United Nations Global Compact, we have a network in Thailand, and I'm Tanya. I'm representative for the Global Compact Network locally. And we are now partnering with CHIF and also, of course, with the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, on implementing the human rights in Thailand. Reflection from the session today, we have enabled uptake the learnings from this application. It seemed very good opportunity that we had engaged with many of the company to talk about how the private sectors or the company, we increase the awareness and see the importance of these mandatory due diligence requirements and the tools. Now it's time for increasing the significantly to be aware that over the past year, Thai government has empowered the company to raise awareness. Of course, from the EU mandatory human rights and environment due diligence law, of course. And company now start to know what are the laws that are expected to impact as a broad range of company around the world, including in Thailand, that we are now drive the implementation of the effectiveness tools, like now that we are now coming to see how important to select the set of tools that will support the business practitioners based in the region as Asia Pacific region that now we are now early adopt and anticipate the implementation and implication of the developments to the company to ensure that they are now well positioned to meet the expectation. Thank you for the introduction of the tools today. It's provide a clear picture of the four flagship products that we are now learning together how it helps and how to use them. And to enable the uptake of the learning, I start with the way forward for this indicator, whether the respect for people is embedded to the company. And now Global Compact Local Network in Thailand will support introduce this set of the indicators that it already has early design. It will be mature in the future, but at least it could help the executive boards, it could help investors, civil society, and standard sector access if the company are wide and connect to identify them and address the risks to the people. First, I have seen the business model Redflex is a good indicator that focus on the way that in which feature of the company business model to put the people at this risk. And it helps, second, to see the set of the leadership and governance indicators of whether the company is creating the right respecting culture. Culture is including the behavior, and we can bring down to the level of theory of change and see how The model will help people to transform the behavior until the end to transform the culture. And we are now getting to learn more from the collection of the case studies and methodologies for assessing the quality of the relationship between the companies and also affected on those stakeholders. There has been some of the indicator as a design tool recently for the company that developed the target and indicator, and it's shown whether whether or not the effort of the change or the effort of these can help advance the respect on human rights, whether it's working well or not. But however, this indicator is designed as a beginning. It might be beyond the compliance. Many of the company also seek to meet the level of the compliance, but some of the tools help us to bring up beyond the compliance. And this practical approach to implement the effectiveness of the human rights due diligence process will help us in the local level to meet up to the global standard. And we can discuss further about how can we upgrade the level of our compliance to meet up all the international requirements. Part of the business model red flag indicator, I think it's very helpful to focus on the way in which filter the company to see how they put the people monitoring in ongoing as well. Beyond the compliance, as we said, I think it's a practical approach to implement the effectiveness beyond the due diligence as a normal process. So that means it's a key takeaway that it's now time for demonstration from the company practitioners, how the resource and the relevance inform the responsible team, whichever team they are in the human resource team, procurement team, and other team, to bring to discuss together as a holistic organization to discuss. And it's helped to assess the company themselves to understand the importance of this mandatory due diligence and beyond the compliance.
Thank you.
At the
Thank
end,
you,
I think
Tanya.
it's inspire people.
Just about 30 seconds more, please, because we have two other speakers we need to get in. Thank you.
Yeah, lastly, from the Global Compact, I hope this brings the tools to contribute to the relevance of the policy level discussion about how to measure and advance the business respect on the human rights. Of course, not only in Thailand, it's going to be by the Asia Pacific region too. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. And now, Dr. Sareem, if we could hand over to you to give your reflections again, just help us step back from all of this and comment on what are your key takeaways from what you've heard.
Thank you. Do you hear me properly?
Yes, very clearly.
Okay, perfect. I'm Siri, and two hats that I wear are particularly relevant to this session. One is I'm now a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which monitor the CESC. And the other is I'm a governor of the Stock Exchange of Thailand. Just a bit of background of the ecosystem in which we are inhabiting. One is we are now seeing a new disclosure rule that is being introduced by or mandated by the Securities Exchange Commission. You'll see so-called one report being used this year for by listed companies that would show, among other things, compliance with or implementation rather with the UNGPs and also the level of carbon emission. The other relevant development is the introduction of SET, Stock Exchange of Thailand, ESG matrix that I'm now looking on my screen. It's being a draft. And some other things, two things. One is from the Banking Association of Thailand, they have introduced so-called sustainable banking. Let me look what language they have used. Sustainable banking guidelines or responsible lending. And the other development is the collaborative agreement signed by 32 institutional investors to use negative list. So amidst this background, let me say three things that the tool that Shift, Mark and your colleague, by the way, congratulations for the new baby, Mark. The three things that the new tool can be used, and I see a lot of potential here. Number one, it is a great literacy tool, awareness tool for risk management, the Redflex particularly. And I like the language used by Yuri that we need to be proactive. So the usage of this set of tools will help us to be proactive. Number two, the tool helps directly with human rights due diligence, which from my hat as a member of CESC, we put in our general comment number 24, propagating for human rights due diligence to be mandatory. And of course, the UN Working Group is also advocating mandatory usage of human rights due diligence. The Redflex in particular will be a tool to complement human rights due diligence. Third point is using or usage of flags and the tools that you have introduced will help further ESG embedment, of course. And let me talk a little bit before my time is up about the new ESG metrics of SET. We have three matrices from E to S to G, total of 129 questions. For S, social dimension, we have 32 questions. And I'm looking at it now, and I see it's being a draft. So I'm contributing my inputs into modifying this. But you know, I'm noticing human rights dimension, employees, community. So when companies look at ESG metrics of Stock Exchange of Thailand, parallel with or in conjunction with the tools introduced by Shift, I think they will see relevance in how they can further embed human rights concern into their operation and policy making. One thing that I want to touch upon is the relevance or nexus between the tools and regulators. I don't think that we can move forward too much if you can't engage with regulators such as the SEC or Stock Exchange of Thailand or institutional investors like the Government Pension Fund of Thailand, who has a lot of leverage to play. When they are aware of this tool, and I perhaps can use one of my hats as one of their board members to bring the attention that we need to use this tool. So I think my time is up, so I'll end my intervention here. Thank you, Mark, for the great contribution.
Thank you, Suri, and thank you for your support throughout the project. I will say two quick things in response to that, and then we'll hand over to Harpreet. We know we're running a few minutes over, everybody, but we are almost at the end of the session. Just to say, we are also very interested now, Suri, at looking at the nexus between these resources and Shift's learning and others learning and the S in ESG. So we hope to pick up that conversation with you and absolutely with institutional investors, and a reminder to everyone that the first funder in this project was Norges Bank Investment Management, right? So they are trying to use the tools and also trying to advocate for their use. So I see opportunity for lots more dialogue between those different actors, regulators and institutional investors, and across regions as well. And Suri will be trying to work with you on those things, I think, as we look to advance these aspects. Harpreet, last but absolutely not least, if we could hand over to you to give your reflections on what you've heard and how you see this positioning in the next decade and across the region, given your sort of personal leadership around these issues through UNDP.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you for sharing these excellent resources. I think a lot of information in very little time to absorb as well. I think these resources are extremely important for the businesses today. The real challenge remains, how do you implement these tools? How do you operationalize these tools in the markets where progress is uneven? There is very little understanding still on the UNGPs, where you see, where the small and medium enterprises and informal economy still dominate. So how do you get these tools to work in an environment like this? And I think also largely you did talk about the cultural context and the social if you look at Asia, the social cultural context is so diverse, and therefore the assumption that dependencies that you're talking about in your theory of change would really change from one place to another. I think the value of these tools is that, as Mark Hughes said, they're backed by research, they're backed by consultations, and they're co-created. I think that speaks a lot, and I think that's where the value of the tool lies. But they still have lots of challenges in implementation of these tools, particularly in Asia. One of the speakers earlier mentioned about randomized controlled trial and engagement with academia along with experts in the field. And just from our own experiences, we know that the appreciation of these methodologies is still very low among Asian markets. So, Mark, you said that you're still this tool is still, evolving and you'd still be kind of, taking feedback. So I think one of the feedback would really be, to make sure that, when we look at the methodologies needs to be responsive, reflexive, reflective as well as flexible in the context of, the business operations and the context of the states and the situations that they would be implemented in. Also remember, majority of the companies do not have dedicated teams focusing on human rights, sustainability, and very few have the capacity or even the resources to use these tools. So I think the key to enhance uptake of these tools is in simplifying them and perhaps engage with a bite-sized approach, right? Where lean teams can also implement. You may not always have like a 10-member team or a 5-member team to implement. So, how do you bring in those, these tools in sort of a bite-sized information? Often less is more. So, kind of take an approach of, you provide them, tools that they can easily implement. The other thing that remember, a lot of people who would be implementing the tool may not be the experts on the subject, right? I mean, you see the businesses not, they're not going to have experts. You would want the tools to be used at different levels, different functions, different operations, and they may not be the experts on the subject. We often, through our experiences, we often engage with companies who come to us and ask for simplifying these tools in their own languages. And in fact, language kind of remains a key barrier in implementation of the tools as well. Last year, we developed a human rights due diligence in COVID-19 rapid self-assessment for businesses to help to consider and manage their human rights impacts of their operations in the context of COVID. Immediately after release, we were approached by business associations, even governments, to translate it into local languages. And now the tool is available in 12 languages, and we've seen how the uptake of tool has increased so much. Not just at the business level, but then also at the associations. The business associations at the country level are now also promoting the uptake of the tool because it's in their language. It's something that that even small and medium enterprises can understand and implement. So I think really simplifying the tools, keep it simple to begin with as well. The other challenge remains, I think, where you have to sort of think about is how do you use this tool particularly for state-owned enterprises, right? How do you engage with governments, especially where there is a very little engagement or political will at the country level? So I think those are somewhere, and speakers before me also spoke about how we can, almost have like these top-down approaches where we're looking at, how businesses are implementing, how we can use investors and how we can use other institutions to implement. But, and I'm just gonna sum up in the, in less than 30 seconds, but I think, Mark, it would be a lost opportunity if we do not build capacity of the civil society organizations or watchdogs, as we call, to use these tools, right? CSOs often find it difficult to secure data and document violations. These tools can be used by the CSOs in their advocacy and help create consumers and investors pressure. So I think that's where is a big opportunity to also build capacity of the CSOs. Lastly, there are already institutions, there are already organizations and associations that are working in the field. And look at the UN, you look at our project, for example, where we have presence in over some 28 countries. We have presence in the 28 countries in the region, but have a ongoing business and human rights project in 12 countries. So how do you build upon, how do you leverage upon the work that's already happening in the field, and how do you work together, building on these partnerships and the commitment? I think that's where also helps increase the uptake of the tool. I think in the end, we need to remember that we don't develop these tools for ourselves. These are the tools for others to use. So, you do need to put your audiences at the center of the design. And I think therefore these needs to be flexible, these needs to be evolving, and these needs to be updated after you've had some data, when more companies have implemented the tool in the regions as well. Thanks, Mark.
Great, thank you, Harpreet. Lots of great flags there of sort of challenges of uptake, which I also think are not particular to Asia Pacific, right? They're very much challenges in many different geographies, but absolutely, I think just as we've tried to be collaborative in the creation and testing of these tools, Harpreet, we intend to be very collaborative and very dependent on others picking these up and different actors, right? The Value and Respect project now has come to almost a close, and so these are there, and we want to be forming partnerships to support uptake, translation, all sorts of mechanisms, and we've had some conversations with partners as well. I also take away, Harpreet, something that's very helpful, that I think what we can do moving forward is to emphasize the different maturities of companies that have been using the resource and the different geographies. So Shirley's example was in China, for example. It was a randomized control trial. Some of the other examples are in Indonesia. Some of them are in Thailand. And so I think what we can do, to your point, is to make sure that as we talk about examples or companies that have used these, that we make sure we profile the use in different geographies already, and profile the way in which they're simplified. And on simplification, absolutely. And we encourage everyone to challenge us to help continue to simplify resources, because our intent here is that they're not just sort of expert only tools, right? That actually they do the opposite, but they build capacity as well as we move forward. So thank you for all those challenges for us. And with that, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our 6 speakers. And we, as I've already intended, hope to continue working with all of you, the 6 of you moving forward and others. And a big thank you to all of the participants as well, for being part of the session, for asking great questions. I hope we addressed a large number of them. If we didn't, please contact the organizers, contact us directly. As we look to the next decade of action, what I think we want to leave you with is the idea that the action that we take is delivering impact and delivering change. And what we are hoping to do here is provide tools, resources, ways of thinking that help us understand whether we are actually having the change that we intend to have. And I think that's what we'd add to the call to action for the next decade ahead. But thank you hugely, and we look forward to continuing to work with many of you and as many of you as possible in the years ahead. Take care and enjoy the rest of the sessions today.
Thank you.